Aloha, glassheads, and welcome to A Glastonbury Romance. It's exactly the color those early Venetians always used, said Miss Crow, for the Madonna's dress. I shouldn't be surprised if it had some peculiar effect on human nerves, this particular blue. I've seen it in many places, Betty, said Matt Decker, but never as deep a shade as here in Glastonbury. It's nice to think we live in a place that's famous for its twilights. Miss Elizabeth adored to be called Betty, and here, sitting opposite her in her bow window, was the only person she would have allowed to do it. By the way, what is that I've heard about Philip turning away some of his hands and threatening to close up one of his mills? Why can't he come to terms with his men? All the old wives I've been talking to in Benedict Street say that their husbands don't want to strike, and it's only this Barter fellow who's making the trouble. What's up with Philip, Bet? Is he getting under the fellow's thumb? Miss Elizabeth tossed up her head. Every woman, old and young alike, had certain gestures, whether of anger or surprise or sadness or detachment, that only one or two persons in the world are permitted to see, and this smile of hers now, with her head held high up in the little back, and her eyes half closed, was one of Miss Crow's gestures that no one else in the world, except her mother and Matt Decker, had seen. It's no good coming to me again to interfere between Philip and his hands, she said. You remember how angry he got when I did it before and how it hurt the men rather than help them? My advices to both sides would always be, come to terms. Do you think Philip realizes what a lot of feeling there is in the town against him? Went on Matt. They told me today that there's a movement going on to elect a new mayor. And of all people in the world, do you know who that has to be? Miss Elizabeth shook her head. Your father's Mr. Geard. No, Matt, you're fooling. Yes, I say yes, Mr. Geard. Impossible, Matt Decker. Ask any of your neighbors and you'll soon see. Does Philip know this? Does Mayor Wallop know this? I can't tell what Philip knows. Old Wallop certainly knows, for he told me himself. She made an impatient movement with her hands. I'm tired of town politics, she said. Matt's face assumed the rather sulky expression that is natural to a man when his interlocutor changes the conversation. But it was then that she soothed the sulkiness away by beginning to talk of Sam. Has he been over there lately? She asked. Not since the woman began living with her husband again, said Matt Decker. But now they tell me Zoyland's going to leave her alone out there while he's at Wookie Hole. He sighed deeply. I like the girl, Betty, he added gravely. Miss Elizabeth smiled. I have seen that for a long time, she said, but you wouldn't like her so well if you made him carry her off. He frowned and sighed deeply again. No, I suppose not, he said, though one feels ashamed sometimes of interfering with a real love affair. I'm a believer in love, Bet, my dear. All passion, I know, is not love, and lechery, of course, is lechery. But all the same, there is such a thing as love, and I have a fixed and rooted notion that when a man and woman really love each other, it becomes, Bet, my dear, he lowered his voice. What does it become, Matt? She asked, moving her cup a little further from the edge of the tray and brushing off, with her fingertips, a few crumbs which were adhering to its beautiful pattern of inlaid mother-of-pearl. It becomes a transaction. A transaction. He broke off with a shrug. What kind of a transaction? She inquired in a calm, controlled voice. I only meant, he said, that just as what I called the Mass is an act that belongs to more than one plane of existence, so any great love between two people may have an importance beyond the world we know. Miss Crow's hands began nervously fidgeting about the objects on the tray. Her portly figure had erected itself very straight as she sat in her chair, but it seemed as if her fingers found it difficult to be as reserved and as dignified as their mistress. I cannot imagine what Sam is feeling or thinking these days, Matt Decker went on. His mind is working it all out in its own way, I think, but I am quite in the dark how he's working it out. Miss Elizabeth looked her friend straight in his troubled eyes. You've changed yourself, Matt, she said. Over all this. You seem prepared to let them go off. Surely it would mean a disaster to you if they did. He rubbed his great, ruddy face with both his bony hands as if to rub off the sticky remnants of a discarded mask. I thought it was just a wanton child's caprice, her taking up with him, he said, letting his hands drop down heavily on this table. But I soon found, when I talked to her, that it was much more than that. Elizabeth shot a quick, sharp glance at him. You're not gone and fallen in love with that woman yourself, Matt, have you? He rose from his chair noisily, making the contents of the tray rattle. Shut up, do, Bet, he groaned. I'm worried by all this. I'm too serious to jest about. But I must go off now. You know what our Penny is. He went over to get his hat and stick with his little parlor sofa. She opened the door for him and held out her hand. I wasn't jesting, Matty, she said. I believe you are a little bit in love with this girl. An electric shock of fury made his big frame tremble from head to foot. I won't allow anyone to talk to me like that. The words burst from him before he had the remotest idea that he was going to be seized by this rush of blind anger. He experienced a little difficulty in the gathering dusk over the latch in the small gate. Miss Crow was soon standing by her side. I didn't mean to tease you, Matt. I thought I ought to have known better, she whispered. He bowed his head so that she could see only his rough eyebrows sticking out beneath the frontal corrugulations, like those of a Neanderthal skull, of his heavy forehead. He regained his composure by staring at a minute ant that was making a dead moth move as if it were alive upon the ground under the gate. He swallowed his saliva in a fierce gulp and raised his head with a jerk. We are a pair of old fools, Elizabeth, he said, and that's the long and short of it. You're much too good to me, and don't you ever think I don't know it. Well, take care of yourself and don't carry that heavy coal scuttle any more. Tossie's got twice the strength you've got. I suppose you carry your own water upstairs, too? Not always, Matt dear, not often. Good night and God bless you. And she turned and re-entered her door. Paragraph break. While Matt Decker, the father, was parting from Elizabeth Crow to return to the kingdom ruled over by penny pitches, Sam Decker, the son, was unwillingly tearing himself away from the lodgings of John Crow, Elizabeth's erratic nephew. It was John, now the salaried secretary of Mr. Gurd, who had made the advances. It was part of his new job to make advances in every direction. John had already approached nearly a third of the educated citizens of Glastonbury, and it had become time to approach the younger Decker. He had given Sam tea in his new room, and Sam, too, like his father, had cursed himself for eating so much bread and butter while the despotic Penny waited for him in the offing. And he had cast a complete glamour over Sam. Sam, unlike his father in this, had no living soul to whom he could tell his troubles. His heavy, brooding nature had been gathering emotional volcanic lava for 3 days, and this night, the night of Zoyland's air trip to Wookiee Hole, his whole being was seething and fermenting with contending passions. While the father sat in Mrs. Crow's bow window on Benedict Street, the son stood at John's casement window at the back of Northland Street. The window looked across a level meadow and across Dye House Lane to the fields lying north of the district called Paradise, and from it could be seen not only the Polden Hills, but, rising up against the horizon, beyond the Bridgewater Fens, the far-off Blue Ridge of the Quantocks. The heavy, powerful youth and the lean, emaciated man were standing side by side, looking out upon the scene. A cheerful fire was burning in John's little grate, and something about his shelves, his chairs, his books, his pots and pans, his gas stove, his couch bed with cushions on it, his few cheap prints, his yet cheaper rug, his shining fender, bore witness to the hand and brain of Mary, while the fact that he was there at all, with everything so comfortably roused round him, bore witness to the liberty of Bloody Johnny. I'm not saying I've ever practiced or ever could practice what I'm talking about, Sam was asseverating in an excited voice. All I'm saying is there's no life that frees anyone so completely from unhappiness as does the mystic life. If you give up possession, if you give up trying to possess what attracts you, a lovely, thrilling happiness flows through you and you feel you're in touch with the secret of everything. There are only 2 mortal sins in the world. One of these is to be cruel and the other is to possess, and they are both destructive of happiness. I agree with you, cried John. The only thing is that the opposite of what you said is true, too. No, no, no. There's a great deal in your Christian method, there's everything in your Christian method, but it must be applied for heathen ends. That's a great doctrine of the Tao, which no one understands except me. A positively diabolic light gleamed in John's glaucous eyes, and his sinuous, feeble form seemed actually to curve in tiny ripples of magnetic coils, like the coils of smoke which followed his cigarette. You're too subtle for me, growled Sam, extending his gray stocking legs and looking down at his enormous dirty boots and at the bright rug chosen so carefully by Mary at Mayor Wallop's shop. I'm only subtle because I'm simple, replied the other. Listen, Decker, he went on. You mustn't think I'm meddling with your private affairs if I give you a piece of advice. A spasm of annoyance crossed Sam's face, and this muscle of his chin contracted. For a second of time, the two men regarded each other like animals of a different species, who had met by accident in a forest glade. The twitch in John's left cheek made a silent signal to Sam's wrinkled chin, very much as the quiver of a rat's whisker might answer the sniff of a badger's snout. Lord, o' Lord, ejaculated Sam, beginning to strike up and down the host's room with his hands in his pockets. So it's come to this, then. Come to what I always feared, that everybody in Glastonbury would know about my troubles. Lord, how I do loathe and hate the human race. That's the advice I'd like you to give me, Crow. I'd like you to say, escape from it all, Sam, you blundering dizzard. Escape from it all and try and imitate those old medieval saints. John Crow looked away. It was one of his peculiarities to be able to stare into people's eyes with a shameless, unsympathetic scrutiny. But Sam's emotion gave him a peculiar feeling of shame. To look at Sam's agitated face any longer at that moment seemed like eavesdropping on a confessional box. So he glanced at the now faintly observable ridge of the Pauldons and thought to himself, there's something in spiritual excitement that makes me uncomfortable. I must have the heart of a stone. My advice would be, Decker, he said in an obstinate low voice, still standing out of the window. My advice would be to do what hares do when they catch sight of something dangerous. That's to say, freeze. You know that word? Turn, pro tem, into the inanimate. Turn into a stump, a post, a clod of clay. Then, after a while, when things have worked themselves out, you can scamper back to your feeding place. He got up from his chair arm and stood hovering at the window. As Sam paused in the sentry's march and threw a glance at him, one of his screwed-up bear eyes, he figured at the window, seemed made up of something less solid than flesh and blood, seemed as if it would need very little to turn it into one of those drifting vapors that floated over the ditches. It's like this, Crow, he began, but he felt so much as if that trampish figure at the window, even as he undressed it, might decompose, dissolve, disintegrate, that he couldn't go on. The chemistry of human bodies, even apart from their shape, is an extroverted manifestation of the souls that animate them. And doubtless in all Glastonbury there couldn't have been found souls more different than John's and Sam's. When he began saying, it's like this, Crow, Sam could feel his own lanky, lumbering frame gather itself together to express his new-grown purpose. But to see the seal of his solemn intention upon the feeble and fluid apparition at the window was as hard as if he were to shoot an arrow into a bundle of feathers or write a credo upon flowing water. Nonetheless, he made one more attempt. It's like this, Crow. For me, the whole thing is dualism. It's a perpetual war against good and evil. Whichever side you take, you get inspired from outside the visible world. But inspiration from the outside evil means in the long run anguish and insanity, while inspiration from the outside good means an ecstasy that grows and grows. To possess is evil. The whole idea of private property is evil. It comes from the devil. What made those medieval saints so happy was that they always said to themselves, let the beautiful girl go free. What's that? What's that your saints say? It was as if a mild mist phantom had been transformed into a mocking goblin. Crow slid back into the room, lurched towards the fire, crouched down on a stool by the grate, and leaning forward towards it as he crouched, stuck a match for the cigarette against the bars. And we'll stop there for today. So I hope you're enjoying your corn tiki. Aloha, everybody. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.